I would like to express my thanks and admiration to Dr. Mohammed Abbas, Dr. Alexander Schütze, and Dr. Friedhelm Hoffman for all their hard work and persistence in organizing this conference despite all the setbacks and difficulties forced upon them by circumstances. Today, I would like to look at the ideological aspects of Ramesside military text and reliefs from the reigns of Sety I and Ramesses II. Beginning in the early 19th dynasty, there is an explosion in the textual, artistic, and literary sources for war and the military. Ideological themes permeate the royal monumental texts and military reliefs of the period. A sophisticated ideology drove the Egyptian conceptions of and motivations for warfare. This paper examines the question of Egyptian military ideology as it shaped the literary and artistic representations of the pharaoh and his army in battle. Ideology also determined the goals and practices of warfare on the battlefield. A dense ideological filter pervades the monumental imagery of Ramesside battle art. It deeply impacts the rhetorical and thematic structure of Ramesside military texts as well. Egyptian scribes and artists expressed this complex ideological conception of warfare through a variety of distinct iconographic motifs and artistic devices, along with a canon of literary themes and tropes. The primary theme of these military accounts is the role of Pharaoh as a superhuman warrior. They contrast his skill and might in battle against the ultimately futile resistance of his enemies on one hand, and his own Egyptian officers and soldiers who are ineffective at best or disloyal at worst. In the interest of time, I will not indulge in a detailed definition of ideology. Suffice it to say that here, ideology refers to the system of ideas and expressions of the Egyptian worldview. Here we are concerned with the ideology of Pharaoh as a warrior and a military leader, as Spallinger has ably clarified in his recent studies. We will also consider the Egyptians' views of and responses to foreign enemies and their characterization as, quote, rebels. Nor will I belabor the well-studied theme of Ma'at, or order, versus Isfet, or chaos. Instead, my goals are to identify and contextualize a number of key artistic and textual themes, tropes, and motifs in the military art and text of Sety I and Ramesses II, in particular Sety's Karnak war reliefs and his larger Beth Shan stela of Regnal Year I, and Ramesses II's narratives of the Battle of Kadesh and the Battle of Nippur. Egyptologists' interest in these sources is often at odds with their ancient purpose. Battle art and formal military text were not sober historical chronicles, but were, as Spallinger calls them, icons of power and victory accounts. Historians seeking to elucidate ancient historical events have often viewed these sources as being, quote, historical, or at least as being evidence, however imperfect, for historical reconstructions. But in assessing the sources, such as Ramesses II's Kadesh narrative or Sety's war scenes, too often we tend to discount the, quote, bombastic rhetoric of these texts and images as being a diversion or an obstacle to the task of recovering historical facts. My own research is heavily indebted to the important work of Mario Liverani, who takes the ideological framework of ancient Egyptian and Near Eastern texts as his primary subject of inquiry. For Liverani, quote, historical facts and events are both secondary and unknowable. In building on his study of ancient ideology, I am more sanguine about our potential for recovering genuine historical data from these sources, while at the same time appreciating them and understanding them as products of Egyptian ideology and worldview. Yet it is only by parsing the ideological themes and devices in these sources and the complex interaction of historical events with the ideological worldview by which the Egyptian sources presented them that we can gain a more nuanced understanding of historical events that the rhetorical text and images celebrate. we can also gain a better understanding of the Egyptian mindset. Now, many of these tropes and themes recur, and observing how and where they turn up time and again is instructive. As Redford has noted in regard to Thutmose III's conference with his advisors at the Aruna Pass on the eve of the Battle of Megiddo, the Egyptians were creatures of their own ideology. But even the idealized account of scripted military events may reflect cases where a pharaoh's actions conformed to ideological themes. Ideology was not just a justification for war. Sety and Ramses fulfilled their ideological roles given to them as a casus belli itself. By applying critical analysis to the text and their themes, along with iconographic analysis of the pictorial motifs and tropes, we can hope to sort out rhetoric from reality, or at least to have a more nuanced view of the sources when common ideological themes are intermessed with potentially historical or factual data. Comparison to other New Kingdom military reliefs and images offers parallels and a context for ideological motifs in the military art and text of Sety I and Ramses II. So if we begin by looking at a single example that will suffice here of a battle scene from Sety's war monument at Karnak, we see that although he uses the traditional imagery of the pharaoh charging his enemies in his war chariot with the reins of his horses tied around his waist, and this is basically a motif that is well established in the 18th dynasty, we also see some novel elements. Again, one of the traditional themes is the king fighting alone, but new iconographic devices that reflect ideology have been introduced. So we see some novel elements here. The king is multitasking. He's holding a sword in one hand and his bow in the other, which he is using as a noose looped around the neck of the Libyan chief so as to strangle him. We also see him standing with one leg hiked up over the edge of his chariot cab and resting on the pole that connects the horses to the chariot. The image is very striking and elegant, but it is unrealistic in terms of how the king would have actually behaved in his chariot in battle. Now, it isn't just the iconography or the rhetorical texts that we see in Sety's battle scenes that reflect ideology. I think it's arguable that his very conduct of his first campaign of victory in the first year of his reign is another reflection of this. If we look at this schematic diagram of the war scenes of Sety on the north wall of the Hypostyle Hall, you can see I've organized them into non-battle episodes that are blue and the actual fighting episodes in red. And when we compare the East Wing, where we have 6 potential battle slots, we see that of the ones that are preserved, that is, of these 6 battle slots, 3 are actually occupied by scenes that do not show fighting. And this is quite a contrast with the Western Wing, where we actually have 3 registers, although we have a couple of scenes hidden behind a wall. But of those battle slots, all of them are in fact scenes of fighting. So what exactly was Sety trying to accomplish on his first campaign of victory? And if we look more closely at the non-battle episodes that are being used to substitute for the battle scenes on the Eastern Wing, one of these is a scene of the king rounding up prisoners after the Battle of Yenuam. But 2 other episodes show him interacting with his potential foreign enemies, but here they are the vassal kings who are shown submitting to him peacefully. And this reflects what I suspect this first campaign was about, was a form, if you will, of chariot diplomacy, a show of force to intimidate and cow his subjects and also to demonstrate his power as a military leader. So we see here the chiefs of Canaan bowing down before the king, who is sitting enthroned in his chariot while he receives tribute of these symbolic metal vases. In another scene around the corner, we have the episode of the king receiving the submission and tribute of the chiefs of Lebanon, who are forced to cut down cedar wood and give it to him. The scene is basically peaceful, although there's one indication that a battle has recently taken place in this fortified town, which is below the king's chariot horse, that has its gate knocked askew. And though this does indicate perhaps some form of fighting, the primary emphasis of the scene is not a warfare, but actually the peaceful submission of the enemy. And when we consider the actual fighting that took place during the first campaign of Sety I, along with some running battles with the Shasu in the vicinity of Sinai and Gaza, we have this remarkable text, his larger Beth Shan stela, that describes how the king fought 3 different local Canaanite city-states, dividing his army and defeating them all in the space of a single day with Beth Shan, Hamath, and Yenuam. Now, even if he is exaggerating the claim that he actually defeated all 3 in the space of a single day, I think it's fair to say that this wasn't much of a fight. These so-called rebelling enemy towns were not a serious threat to the hegemony of Egypt in the Levant during Sety's reign. In fact, I think this may even demonstrate a theory that Mario Leverani put forward with regard to Akhenaten in the Amarna letters, where the king seemed to ignore the pleas of local vassals who complained that other vassal kings were fighting against them and begged the king for military aid. And as Leverani puts it, that this sort of abnormal situation, or what he called permanently abnormal situation, was a case where the pharaohs would tolerate squabbling among their vassals as long as all remained loyal to Egypt. Therefore, we have a situation of divide and conquer. And perhaps that's what the local rulers in Sety I's first year expected that they could do. But in this case, Sety, looking to demonstrate his military credentials, was looking for any enemy that he could possibly fight. And the local vassals simply miscalculated, and Sety fulfilled his ideological role as a defeater of rebellion against him and his role as a warrior pharaoh by campaigning during this time and overcoming these 3 fortified towns. Now, when we look at the rhetorical inscriptions, in fact, the legends in most of these battle scenes are highly rhetorical. And again, it's easy to dismiss this as of little interest, except its literary qualities. But I think we can actually see the ideology of how the king is presented in battle. And in particular, the fact that the king is not so much presented as a warrior who fights battles, but as a top predator, a fierce animal who instantly makes kills. And we see him compared to various forms of predatory and dangerous animals, including falcons, jackals, lions, panthers, and wild bulls. And if we look more closely at some of the language that surrounds the description of the pharaoh as a predatory animal, we can see some things that turn up even in the semantic determinatives that are attached to the writings of certain terms. And so here we see a term har, which is often used of New Kingdom pharaohs to say how they, quote, raged in battle. And what is interesting is if you look at the way the word is often spelled, as in the bulletin of the Battle of Kadesh narrative of Ramesses II, it's determined often with a male hydramous baboon. And when we consider the aggressive, even vicious displays and behavior of these alpha male baboons, where they intimidate their troops to keep them in line, this becomes the perfect metaphor for the king who goes berserk, or if you will, goes ape in combat. Another way that we see the king compared in his actions in battle as an ambush predator is the case of a term that is used to describe Thutmose III in his Jebel Barkal stela, a term seshed that means something like to flash, and that describes him flashing among the enemy ranks of bowmen like, quote, a star when it crosses the sky, in other words, a meteorite. Now, the term means to flash or to move quickly, But I suspect that the extended meaning means to attack suddenly or to ambush. If you will, in German, this would be blitzen or Blitzangriff. And the term Seshet is determined with a crocodile. And again, if we consider the behavior, the ambush attacks of crocodiles that stay very still until the prey gets close, and they explode into an instant of violent action and seize their prey, this again becomes a metaphor for the king as a predatory animal. Now, what this adds up to is a traditional image of the pharaoh as a fearsome warrior who actually behaves more along the lines of a predatory animal, who quickly overwhelms his enemies who cannot resist him and overcomes them in the blink of an eye. And this type of language is well established in the 18th dynasty and also into the Ramesside period, both before and after Ramesses II. But against this traditional imagery, I would like to consider some particular innovations in the Battle of Kadesh narrative. And both in terms of the artistic record and the literary treatments in the so-called bulletin and poem, we do see a number of traditional elements in the Battle of Kadesh narrative. The king's solo victory, although Ramses is often criticized for claiming that he fought alone when obviously, as he tells us, his army was there. This is actually quite normal for other Egyptian pharaohs or even other ancient Near Eastern kings. We also see the failure of the Egyptian army, which I think is also an echo of similar statements in the failure of the army of Thutmose III to do its duty at the Battle of Megiddo, or the passage from Tutankhamun's restoration stela that complains that if an army was sent to Jahi to extend the borders of Egypt, it met with no success. And we also see a fair amount of the rhetoric of the traditional warrior or predatory king, as we saw in the example with Ramses raging in battle. The text also, and here I would like to call out the work of Tony Spallinger again for his analysis of the Königsnovelle themes and also the format of the poem as a Nachtu text. But there are a number of innovative features that I think we can see in the Battle of Kadesh narrative, many of them well known, such as the very complex textual and visual narrative, especially the innovative camp scene. And also, I think, just as importantly, the dramatic tension, much more than in the Battle of Megiddo, where at least for a moment, the outcome of the battle seems in doubt, and things very much do not go Ramses' way from the time that he is deceived by the Shasu Bedouin to the point in which the Hittites launch their ambush. Now, the most important thing, I think, that is transforming the ideology of Ramses as a warrior in the Kadesh narrative is Ramses' great moment of jeopardy. And as the poem describes, when he gallops off into the midst of the enemy and finds himself deserted by his own soldiers, looking around and sees himself surrounded by 2,500 units of chariots, despite the fact that he's a solo warrior who, quote, defeats millions, the narrative plays up his jeopardy and his vulnerability. And in many ways, the Kadesh narrative tries to have it both ways. Ramses is a solo warrior, but he is somehow also vulnerable. He is said to be the traditional protector of his troop, the mountain of copper, or the fortress of iron around his troops. And yet he bitterly complains that all of his officers and infantrymen and charioteers deserted him in his time of need. Of course, much has been said by Osman and others about Ramses' personal piety and his plea to Amun, who then strengthens his hand. But even at one point, Ramses reproaches Amun himself for having abandoned him in his moment of need. And what this all amounts to, I think, is a daring new narrative for how the pharaoh is described in battle. Ramses has become a true hero in this sense. The novelty of the Kadesh narrative is perhaps a reflection of genuine historical events at Kadesh, where he found himself in an ambush. But surely Ramses was not the first Egyptian pharaoh to face the prospect of defeat in battle. But if this ever came to pass with earlier pharaohs, they generally didn't talk about it. He had made the choice to portray the battle in this fashion. And I think part of this is that Ramses is latching on to a traditional archetype of the heroic journey and the heroic struggle that is found throughout the Western tradition and dates all the way back to the time of the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, where even a godlike king like Gilgamesh with all his powers still struggles against defeat and death. We also see this heroic archetype in the characters of Achilles or Hercules and other Greco-Roman heroes. Now, the concept of the heroic archetype is not without its detractors, but I think it is a theme in Western ancient literature. But when we look to Egyptian sources, it's fairly rare. Perhaps the best example of the hero's journey and the heroic mold is the case of the fictional Sinuhe, who has his moment of crisis when he overhears news of the king's death. He experiences adversity as he makes his way into Western Asia and escapes from Egypt. He overcomes all of his challenges and returns home redeemed and a hero. We can also see this, I think, to some extent in the case of shipwrecked sailor. You could even argue that the god Horus himself in the epic of the contest of Horus and Seth also experiences the heroic journey. Now, despite this, the vehicle of the hero's journey and the heroic mold is inappropriate for Pharaoh, who never faced true adversity and never faced death and defeat. And so when Ramses does this, I think he is making a significant departure from the traditional imagery and role of the pharaoh in battle. Now, scholars have often used the term heroic to describe the military activity or the military prowess of New Kingdom pharaohs. But in this sense, I don't think they rise to the true level of the heroic archetype. You have a case such as Kamosa, who displays great bravado, but is never really in serious danger. And as Tony Spellinger pointed out, with Thutmose at the Aruna Pass, the danger was mostly potential. He was really never in danger of his life, as Ramses II seemed to be at the Battle of Kadesh. And despite elaborate battle narratives of these earlier kings, from Kamosa to Sety I, the king always effortlessly and instantaneously and inevitably defeats his enemies in battle. There's never really a moment of doubt. Now, this case of the pharaoh as a hero who faces adversity in battle, I think is extended in Ramses' account of the Battle of Dapur. But here, the king deliberately puts himself at risk. And as he describes in his rather chatty speech, he brags that he was able to fight for 2 hours shooting arrows at the city of Dapur without putting on his body armor. And again, this emphasis on royal risk-taking, a form of reckless bravado, is an echo perhaps of the Kadesh narrative where the danger was not voluntary. But nonetheless, in both instances, by being in danger and showing such bravado when he overcomes the enemy, it makes the victory all the more sweet, that makes his heroic status all the more secure, because it was not an instantaneous victory, but that he actually was in jeopardy. When we actually look at the two visual narratives of the Battle of Dapur, we have the one from the Ramesseum here. We see the king charging the city in his chariot with some of his sons participating in the battle and the siege. It contrasts rather sharply with the details that we see in the temple of Luxor, where the king fights on foot. And so when we consider these types of sources, we have to understand that they are also ideological. And although they may record actual events, they can also have contradictory details. Now, I want to close with the ultimate symbol of the pharaoh in the New Kingdom as a warrior, the traditional icon of the king charging alone in his chariot with the reins of the horses tied around his waist, shooting arrows single-handedly. And what is interesting is the fact that the king is always shown alone, which is perhaps to be expected. But of course, we also know from the Battle of Kadesh narrative that the poem mentions his chariot driver, a man named Mena. And the question is then, why is Mena in the poem at all, especially when he's not shown with the pharaoh in the scenes of the Battle of Kadesh? This is from Rossellini's copy, an image of a man in armor holding the reins of Ramses' chariot team. And if anybody is, this is probably Mena, although there's no caption identifying him explicitly. But why then does Mena appear in the narrative of the poem? And I think what is going on is that he becomes a convenient foil. His panicky state of mind contrasts with Ramses' stout-hearted bravery. He also represents all the other Egyptian chariot officers and soldiers that desert the king on the battlefield. And so he is a narrative foil that contrasts with the pharaoh's bravery. But much like Ramses' bodyguards and followers, and I would like again to call out the work of Dr. Mohammed Rafat Abbas, who's looked at the bodyguards of Ramses at the Battle of Kadesh, they explicitly serve along with Mena as witnesses who can testify to the king's bravery, especially as he supposedly fought in isolation from his own troops. Now, if we look at other chariot scenes from the New Kingdom, it's only very rarely that we see another person, or in this case, with Thutmose IV, deity in the chariot with the king. In the Amarna chariot scenes, the king is often in his chariot with his wife Nefertiti, and sometimes with one or more of his daughters. We have this unique case in one of the two scenes on Thutmose IV's chariot body that shows the god Montu appearing next to the king and steadying his aim. And this also reflects the imagery that describes the king as actually an avatar who becomes Montu in battle. Now, if we look elsewhere for images of the king in his battle chariot with anybody, it's only rarely that we ever see it. And really, I think the only other example that is not an official formal piece of art, but actually a kind of ancient Egyptian political cartoon, a late 19th dynasty sketch that shows a king and a queen fighting each other in their chariots, and they have drivers, of course, and presumably the figure on the right is a pharaoh with his driver. It's a bit damaged, but this is not an official image. It's actually almost a parody of an official image. So it again is a kind of exception that proves the rule. And so we are left finally with the ideology of the king as a warrior. And although it is also transformed and enriched in the Ramesside period, it is also quite apparent that the traditions of the ideological narrative of Pharaoh as a super warrior who single-handedly defeats his enemies like a predatory animal in the space of an instant is well established. And so I think we can see that ideology is not just sort of a kind of window dressing, but actually a profoundly ideological worldview that informs both the sources, textual and iconographic, that represent Ramesside war, but even the king's behavior and goals on the battlefield in war. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.